My name is Ember Kelly. I am the Director of Religious Education at the Fourth Universalist Society. I use she and her pronouns. It's so good to be here with you all tonight, and I'm so excited for the second in our currently four, possibly adding a fifth even, but the second of four Religion and Socialism speakers as part of a speaker series we're doing here at the Fourth Universalist Society. It's so good to have you here, and I just want to promo our upcoming upcoming, we have next week, same time, same place, organizing as Practical Theology with Ben Haney. And then a few weeks from now, same time, same place, Loneliness, Capitalism, and Religion with Rafael Diaz. And since you are here, I'm assuming you already did the sign up and knew how to get there, but at fourthu.org/socialism, where we will also keep a recording of these talks. We already have Talia's from last week about futures of religion and socialism is on there as well. And so I am so excited for tonight's event for thinking about Buddhism and socialism with Ravi Talati, and I am just excited to learn. This is not an intersection of religion and socialism that I know really anything about, so I am excited to be here to learn as much as I am to moderate and administrate. And so, Ravi, I will hand it over to you.
Brilliant. Yeah, I just want to say it's a real honor to be invited to speak today. As you can tell, I mean, it's midnight here in the UK, so you can tell I'm passionate about this. It's one of these things that really interests me, obviously, as someone who is a socialist and who is religious, you know, the intersections of socialism and religion. But there's not many, I've come across a lot of religious socialists, but it's not something that I see talked about much. So I'm really happy that this is happening. I've got a little presentation as well, so I'm just going to share my screen. Right, so I'll just a little bit about myself, just so you're all know a little bit about me. I'm from Manchester in England, best city on the planet, in my opinion. I know a lot of you will be New Yorkers and probably quite passionate about your city, but I'm afraid Manchester is the greatest city on the planet. By trade, I'm a software engineer. Please don't ask me about your IT problems, though. Not that kind of person. Political. I am on a bit of a break at the moment, but I am also quite politically active in my spare time. Have been for a lot of my 20s, and I'm going to talk a lot about that in a second. I would call myself a communist, so there's a little bit of debate among socialists, you know, what terms do we have, and lots of people have different opinions. I prefer the term communist just because you know, Marxist works as well, but I think Marx wouldn't have really enjoyed the term Marxist. I think, you know, he always said that ideas, philosophy come from people, from the masses. I think communism is a much more accurate way to describe something. I mean, you wouldn't call a biologist a Darwinist or a physicist a Newtonist. So to me, yeah, I prefer the term communist. I'm not a very good one, but I am a Buddhist. I've very recently sort of converted about 2 years ago. Did my formal refuge ceremony last year. And even though I don't meditate as much as I should, I am very passionate about Buddhism and its philosophy, and I enjoy talking about it as much as I can. Yeah, and in my spare time, you know, I'm also constantly sort of studying other religions, learning about theology, history, you know, very casually. I'm not an expert or an academic or anything like that. I just thought I'd add on the end, if you know, the beanie and the scraggly writing on my shirt didn't give it away. I'm a metalhead as well, big into heavy metal. So yeah, do hit me up if you are as well. I definitely could talk a lot about the overlap between Buddhism and heavy metal. So To start off with, so just to give you a rundown, I'm going to talk a little bit about myself first. I know that I will talk about Buddhism and socialism for a little bit, but I just wanted to give some, some background when I start talking about my ideas later on, so you've got an idea of my experiences and why I've come to the conclusions I have. So my history as a socialist, a communist, whatever you want to call it, when I was a kid, wasn't that politically minded. I mean, most kids aren't. I'm quite surprised though, having come across a few, worked with a few socialist youth organizations. I'm surprised at how increasingly left wing a lot of teenagers are these days. But at the time, I didn't really know much about politics. But my parents were very politically minded. I'd say they're quite liberal. Always voted Labour. Always had very strong opinions and always made sure to educate me on politics and explain things to me. My mum especially, gave me a really good sense of sort of justice and fairness. And I think that contributed a lot to me becoming a socialist later on. And of course I would then live through 9/11 and the new Labour government, and I was actually born a Muslim. I was raised Muslim. So 9/11 especially had a big impact on me, and I started really showing me sort of the aspects of racism and in front of me in real time, and sort of imperialism as well. Imperialism has always been something that's I've been quite aware of. Going on to school, I would then learn about the USSR, Palestine and Ireland, and that really helped develop me politically. Especially the USSR. I mean, I was suddenly hearing about the situation where, workers who had been oppressed for ages, basically set up their own sort of self-governance and, overthrew the government, and it gave me this idea, started to give me this idea that, there are other systems of governance out there. And I was learning about Ireland and Palestine. Ironically, the module was on terrorism, but it made me very sympathetic to their struggles, actually, because these people were trying to reclaim their countries, basically their homelands. So suddenly I was learning a lot more about imperialism and the role it played in politics, and especially the Irish. And to this day, the Irish struggle is definitely something I'm very sympathetic to. But I wouldn't say I was still I wouldn't say I was a socialist at this time. I didn't really know much. In fact, actually, around about the age of 16, I considered myself a liberal Democrat, as in the Liberal Democrat Party. But that was just because I really didn't like New Labour. I knew I didn't like Labour because I didn't like New Labour, didn't like Blair, didn't like Gordon Brown. And Liberal Democrats were the only sort of alternative I knew. So I went on this way for quite a while. Went through uni. I'd come across a few left-wingers and stuff, but I didn't really have any strong opinions. And then Brexit happened, and I think Brexit was a big turning point in a lot of young people's lives here. Funnily enough, I voted Remain, but I would say I'm actually now on the opposite side of the fence. I'm pro-Brexit, but Brexit really is where I started to lose faith in the sort of current system of governance and started to look for alternatives. The debate was just awful on both sides. Basically had the choice between sort of the existing neoliberal system, which just expected us to vote for it just because, and then the Brexit side, which was full of, anti-immigration, nationalism, just a lot of toxicity, and, the sort of result of Brexit, the increase in sort of attacks on immigrants and things like that, just, yeah, I knew that something was really, really wrong. And at this point, this is when I started to look into alternatives. And that's when I came across the Communist Manifesto. I know there's a lot of Marxists out there who don't recommend it as a beginner's book for some reason, but I really rate it. I think it's a fantastic piece of literature, and for me, it was a huge turning point. I mean, as I read through it, I was like, this is all correct. The world is made of two classes. There is an oppressive. It all made sense, and oh yeah, history does work like that. History makes so much more sense when you talk about class struggle. So this is when I started to looking into socialist theory and things like that. I think for quite a while, I thought myself as an anarchist for a while. But that, I started to read a bit more, and I wouldn't, I do like some anarchist texts. I definitely like Kropotkin, for example. But I'd definitely say I'm a Marxist. Definitely, I read a lot of Lenin at that point, State and Revolution particularly. So that really brought me to being more of a sort of more Marxist side of things. So of course, at that point, I was like, I've read all this theory. What do I do? So, since then, I've worked with a few socialist organizations, worked with a few anti-austerity campaigns, specifically worked with trade unions, and done a little bit of sort of anti-fascist work as well. And the trade unions and the socialist organizations, this was the first time I would be, I would meet other workers, face to face, have proper political conversations, and that really helped develop my political opinions that I have today. The trade union work, especially, is I've learned so much from that, and learning that really it's not all so glamorous. Socialism is it's not all red flags and storming parliament or storming government buildings. It's a lot of admin work, and it's quite it can be quite boring at times, quite tedious, a lot of meetings and voting. So yeah, it was a really, really good experience, and yeah, I've learned a lot from it. So yeah, I am currently on a break a little bit, but I am looking to join again, start getting back involved again this year. Probably hoping to maybe try and get some more organization happening within sort of sphere of software engineering and things like that, which there is a real lack of. So anyway, enough about the socialism. I'll talk a little bit about why I converted to Buddhism. Now there's a lot less to talk about here because I have only just recently converted, but it has been a path that's taken a long time. So like I said earlier, I was raised Muslim, but both of my parents were never that interested. My mum was raised Christian, and she was my mum's English, by the way. I'm mixed race, so she was raised Christian. My dad was raised Muslim. Mum went through a sort of a small phase when she was about 18, 19, but she was quite interested in sort of different sects of Christianity. And I think she joined the Methodist Church for a while, but eventually sort of became disillusioned with it. And my dad, he was only really into Islam because of the community aspects, and he left that afterwards. So they were quite critical of religion. So as a result, I never really engaged with it much. And my experience, I think a lot of people who are religious might relate to this, of the experience of sort of religion being kind of like a bunch of rules that are enforced on you and not much else. And, at that point, you sort of, you don't, you can end up being quite critical of it. I think a lot of people are. So, when I was a teenager, I sort of said I don't really identify as Muslim anymore. I don't really want anything to do with it. And from there on, I would say I was an atheist. But towards sort of my early 20s, I dealt with a lot of mental illness, issues with depression, and Marxism helped a lot with that. It's sort of the Marxist philosophy. It can be it's very optimistic philosophy, but still, I think Marxism can lack answers to more fundamental questions of things like why are we here? What's the purpose of humanity? What's the ideal way of living? It does touch upon it sometimes, but ultimately, obviously, socialist theory is based on socialism and political structures and the next stage of human history. So doesn't have much to say about these things. So I knew I had this longing for some form of spirituality or some form of guiding path. So I began researching, in my spare time, and I researched. I considered everything from, Catholicism, the Quakers, Islam again, Judaism. I went into the occult. I studied a little bit of the occult. Got into Satanism a little bit, which I know might make some people laugh because it's quite the opposite of Marxism. But that's really the reason I struggled a lot with it, because it's quite an individualistic religion. So yeah, I had a lot of difficulties because I very strongly held these Marxist beliefs, but a lot of religions do clash a little bit, or at least on the surface they seem to clash with Marxism. So yeah, so I was finding it hard to reconcile a lot of religious philosophy. I think the issue with a lot of religious philosophy, and it's not wholly true, but I feel like there's a lot of when you first engage with it, it starts off with a lot of with the concept of God, or some sort of what I'd say is more idealistic stage of philosophy, is in the philosophical school of idealism, and it sort of takes it, it presents it as being sort of true from from a starting point. So I was already struggling with that, because I didn't really believe in God at that time. But yeah, eventually I came across a book on Tantra, the ancient Buddhist Hindu system of spirituality. Specifically, it's a really good book called Agora. I do recommend it to anyone who's interested in Indian religion. It's the life of an Agori from India, and he did touch on Buddhism a little bit. So I thought, oh, I didn't realize there was such a thing as tantric Buddhism. And I didn't realize I didn't know much about Buddhism. I hadn't, all I knew about Buddhism at the time was fasting monks, and I didn't really have much of an opinion. But then I started looking into it, and I was amazed, at what Buddhist philosophy was. It's very, very different to what I imagined it to be. It's first of all, how much of it aligned with my views at the time, and it's very. I don't want to say other religions aren't rational and logical, because they are. There's been loads of rational philosophy, especially in like Christianity, but it is from the surface level. As soon as you engage with it, it's very concrete. It's very rational, very logical. Works from the ground up. It says, the Buddha, specifically worked from what you could already know and verify, right now in front of you, and then works from there. And so I was like, so, I'm reading up about, dependent origination. I'm like, yes, this makes sense, because of course the world does, well, I like, it's obvious, we know now, that, say, the human body is made up of cells, which are made up of proteins, which are made up of atoms. Of course, yeah, that does make sense. And, um, and even, and then that led to, like reincarnation making sense to me. And the other thing is, Buddhism is not really, I think, very similarly to Marxism, it's not really focused on metaphysics. I mean, it does exist, the Buddha and Buddhist thought does have strong opinions on metaphysics, but it's mainly focused on what you can do practically to end your suffering and the suffering of others. And it gives you a lot of practical advice on, how to make your life better through, meditation, through mindfulness. And, that's worked for me. I was already, dealing with mental illness. I was already practicing some forms of mindfulness. I was already practicing meditation at the time. So I already knew this stuff worked, and, Buddhism just sort of helped with that. I just want to stress again, I don't think Buddhism is like better than any other religion. I'm just particularly passionate about it. That's why I talk about it so great. I strongly believe, whatever religion you follow is the right one for you, and all religions, have good and truth in them. And really encourage everyone to follow what they feel best. But if that if you enjoy sort of that sort of thing, that rationality and the logical side of philosophy, then Buddhism makes a lot of sense. So spoiler. So just talk a little bit about the history of Buddhism and socialism. I just want to say I'm not an expert on these things. I did a lot of the research when I was coming up with the presentation for this. I'm not an academic, but it is interesting. Definitely, please look into it. First thing I want to say is that I don't believe any religion is inherently any kind of follows any sort of politics. There's no sort of inherently socialistic. You can find socialistic aspects in a lot of religions, and all forms of politics, have used religion to push certain agendas, certain goals. Buddhism has been used both for sort of liberal movements. It's definitely been used for fascist movements. We know about Japan and the issues, the genocides on the Rohingya Muslims, which are a real shame, and not completely condemned. So I'm not going to say that Buddhism is inherently socialistic, but it is interesting at the sort of history behind the relationship and of socialism and Buddhism, because it has overlapped more than you would expect. However, unfortunately, it has, for most of socialist history, Buddhists and socialists have been, have clashed a lot. I think a lot of socialists have been anti-religion, especially in the past, and it makes sense because this was in times when religion was often very much tied in with the government. Socialists across Europe were very critical of the church, for example. So it makes sense that socialists in the East would also be very critical of Buddhist institutions who might have been in line with the government. So it was definitely seen as sort of a sign of an outdated view or culture, which a lot of these socialist movements in the East want to get rid of. However, it's also interesting to know that with a lot of the anti-colonial movements you'd find in East Asia, Southeast Asia, you would find a lot of occasionally Buddhist and socialist syntheses, mainly because sometimes because Buddhism was seen as kind of like an indigenous religion. Maybe it was tied in with sort of the national culture which people wanted to preserve. They might be using it as a sort of like, look, Buddhism's more naturally, works with our anti-colonial our independence movement, as opposed to something like Christianity, which was often seen as the religion of colonizers, or a foreign religion. So there were these cases where Buddhists and socialists, did come together. So yeah, so I've got a few you can see on the background there. Yes, that is the Dalai Lama, His Holiness. We've also got Han Yong-un and Ambedkar, who's a particular interest of mine. First, I'm going to talk about Gendon Pelgidin. I might be saying that wrong, but he was the first president. So I think he's the first case of where you would have Buddhism and socialism start to come together. And he was the first president of the Mongolian People's Republic. And he was a staunch Buddhist himself. Ultimately, he would get purged in the 30s after being asked by the Soviet government to liquidate Buddhist institutions at the time, which he fought against. So he would be replaced from office and then unfortunately executed in the purges. However, he was quoted as saying that he said that I think Lenin and Buddha were some of the greatest geniuses in history. So he definitely held both in high esteem. I think going on then, I think the most sort of notable after him would be Ambedkar. So if you don't know him, he was a major figure in the Indian sort of independence movement, and particularly he was from the lower castes, from the Dalit caste. So a big part of his struggle was also fighting against the caste system, and he talked a lot about religion, during his time. He explored a lot of religions, and he thought religion would be a way to sort of help use it, could be used as a tool to fight against the caste system. He saw Hinduism as not being useful for Dalits anymore. So eventually settled on Buddhism, converted to Buddhism, and he did a lot of as close to probably heresies you can get in Buddhism. He started a form of Buddhism called Navayana. It's very hotly sort of a lot of Buddhists with a lot of different opinions on it, but it is very interesting nonetheless. And he sort of changed a lot of the fundamentals of Buddhism to be about. So he said, suffering comes about as part of class struggle rather than desire. One of the Four Noble Truths. He rewrote a lot of the history of the Buddha, but I think it was Jefferson who rewrote the Bible. He did like a rational version of the Bible. So he did something similar with the Buddha's life story. Did a very sort of got rid of all the supernatural elements and told it very plainly. But yeah, despite what many people might believe about him, he's, probably the biggest reason that Buddhism has had its revival in India. Majority of the Buddhists in India are, followers of Ambedkar. And he was also, very much influenced by Marx as well. He wrote a very interesting piece of work called Buddha or Marx, or I think it was Karl Marx and the Buddha, which is, I really recommend to everyone. Very interesting if you want to learn more about him. He did settle on Buddhism in the end, but he's always been, definitely was a socialist, like many sort of the Indian nationalists were at the time. And then also interesting to note is Han Yong-un. He was a sort of big figure in the Korean independence movement. During the time they were being occupied by Japan, And he definitely tried to, he was very much involved in the socialist movement and tried to synthesize, he saw it was very, very natural to merge the two together. So yeah, he tried to, a lot of the socialists were quite critical of Buddhism at the time, but he was trying to, he sent a lot of letters out saying actually, ideally Buddhism, and refuted a lot of what they said and said, ideally, if we really did enact Buddhism properly, it would be socialistic. It teaches non-attachment, ending suffering, so of course it goes hand in hand. And then Jiro Seno, I think that's how you pronounce it, was also an interesting figure in Japan. He wasn't really influenced by Marxism, but he created a sect of Buddhism which advocated for creating what you called a pure land in this world, kind of, I think, similar to sort of maybe like Quaker ideas of sort of heaven on, building the kingdom of God on earth sort of thing, which he said would be anti-capitalist, or would be socialist in some form, and would unfortunately end up being arrested and sort of tortured by the imperial government for promoting this sort of Buddhist socialism. And then also it's probably worth mentioning the Buddhist Socialist Party in Burma, who sort of created a synthesis of Buddhism and socialism. But I am hesitant to sort of really say they were sort of socialist. I think they sort of persecuted and fought a lot with the Communist Party during liberation there, and of course they are currently the ruling party in Burma. And the sort of result of all the issues going on there. So I think any sort of socialist ideals they may have followed, I think, don't really exist these days. And then I think finally I'd like to talk a little bit about the Dalai Lama, because His Holiness the Dalai Lama, he's quite interesting to me, quite contentious amongst a lot of communists. And I think a lot of people are quite surprised when they find out, when I say he's a socialist, but he has himself many times described himself as half Marxist, half Buddhist. He says that socialism is Marxism is founded on good morals and ethics. He's even apparently referred to Mao Zedong as his grandfather, as like a grandfather to him. They did meet, which I know is probably quite surprising. He does, however, believe that the USSR and other socialist countries were not true socialism, and he sort of advocates for more of a peaceful sort of reformist method. But he does describe himself as Marxist. I'm still sort of I don't know what to think of him in terms of his political beliefs, but I think he's really interesting to sort of learn about at the moment, because he's definitely, in terms of a modern day example of someone who's merging Marxist and Buddhist thought. He's one of the main contenders, really. So yeah, and I think in general, I mean, there's a lot of people who haven't, a lot of notable Buddhist figures who may not have been outwardly socialist, but there's definitely been many who have been critical of capitalism. A lot of the, in my time listening to a lot of Tibetan lamas, a lot of them generally are very critical of how capitalism occurs in the West, because it doesn't rely on promoting greed and mindless consumption, which are antithetical to a lot of Buddhist ideas. So I think it's quite interesting how many of them are. Obviously not all of them, but I think Dzongzar Khyentse Rinpoche, for example, he's quite critical. So yeah, and then you've had figures like Thich Nhat Hanh who, you know, have been very engaged and quite, I'd say, socialistic in their approach, when it's, you know, coming into in the practice of Buddhism. So yeah, so there's been a lot of interesting examples of Buddhism and socialism colliding in the past. So you're probably thinking, what do I think? You know, as someone who is a socialist and a Buddhist. So I made a handy graphic. Made this a while back, and yeah, that's all I have to say really. I'm only joking. I've got actual ideas. So my own opinion is, I think fundamentally they are, you know, the different philosophies. I'm not, you know, like I said earlier, Buddhism is not inherently socialistic or anything like that, because it's not really answering the same question as Marxism. Marxism is, you know, is trying to figure out why human history is the way it is, and you know, what's the best way of creating revolution. Buddhism is trying to answer the question about human suffering, and, you know, what's the best way to reach the truth of the, you know, of the universe, of reality. But it's quite interesting that they kind of somehow answer the same questions, I'd say, about human suffering, but from different ends. Marxism is a materialist philosophy, so it says, you know, we must rely on the world around us, and study that to, you know, if we want to end human suffering, that's how we end class struggle. Whereas Buddhism says, you know, we need to look to our ideas and inwardly. But both of them say, you know, both are just as important. So, you know, Buddhism says, you know, ideas affect the material world, and the material world affects your ideas. Marxism says the material world affects ideas, and then your ideas affect the material world. So I think there is a lot of similarity in terms of the sort of dialectical aspects of both philosophies. I think also when you're talking about, when you're going on to sort of Mahayana philosophy, you know, when we're talking about bodhisattvas and the bodhisattva vow, exactly, you know, you're talking about ending other people's suffering. Is, you know, this idea of ending the aspect of the self and things like that, which, you know, if you're going out to end other people's suffering, clearly, you know, to me, that it just seems like, obviously, that would it also involve, you know, ending the systems that cause suffering, you know, ending things, you know, inequality, poverty, you know, imperialism, oppression. That's, you know, it seems to go hand in hand. And I think a lot of other Buddhists also agree, you know, hence why we've got an engaged Buddhist movement these days, you know, hence why, you know, we had people like Thich Nhat Hanh with his ideas. So I think that, you know, that I think naturally, I think you would end up with some sort of socialist ideas from that. And then I'd like to, yeah, just talk about engaged Buddhism. I think, you know, that also provides a good template of, you know, how Buddhism can share a lot in common with socialism. You know, Buddhism says that, you know, it's not enough just sitting in a monastery, and, you know, this goes all the way back to the Buddha himself. You know, the whole aspect of the community of monks is they were meant to serve the community around them, and then in return they were looked after by the community. You know, might not necessarily work that way across the whole world, but, you know, engaged Buddhism is definitely a sort of a revival of that. You know, and it's saying, look, you know, to be a good Buddhist, it's not enough to just meditate and practice mindfulness. You need to go out and help other people. You need to help, you know, whether that is, you know, just teaching them mindfulness, or whether that's physically helping them, you know, with providing them shelter and food, and, you know, fighting against oppression. I think ultimately, you know, my own sort of view when it comes to just in generally spirituality, I think, you know, capitalism just does not provide a good environment, or you know, it actively inhibits spiritual practice. I definitely see that. I think a lot of religious organizations these days tend to suffer from this. They've lost a lot of the spiritual aspects, and tend to focus more on things like on the politics, or just material aspects, and they've forgotten. I think this is why a lot of people are increasingly becoming sort of atheistic in the West, because it's not really, religion is failing to answer a lot of their questions now. How can you be a spiritual person? How can you find yourself, freeing yourself from attachment to material world, when capitalism requires us to all, is constantly encouraging us to mindlessly spend, mindlessly exploit each other, and it's isolating us from each other. So it's not really, it's very difficult to be spiritual under capitalism. I think ultimately, might be a bit controversial to say, but I think, if ideally, if you believe in a world of spiritual freedom, and where everyone is free to practice spirituality, and you want the whole of humanity to develop themselves spiritually, we need socialism. We can't have a world where people are fighting every day to access basic needs, who are constantly being exploited, where everything is designed for profit. That's not conducive. If that's all we're focused on, we don't have time for spirituality. So that last line is because I'm very much inspired by a lot of the stories of sort of ancient India, where you had yogis, a lot of people who would just wander India, debating each other, coming up with philosophy, and would start the foundations of things of maths and science. And I see socialism as a path to creating a world where everyone, that idea of the sort of the philosopher king that Plato had. But I think all of us could be that. And I think when we live in a world without a class system, I think all that's left, and all our needs are met, all that's left is to pursue philosophy, science, to develop ourselves, and to seek knowledge. And Buddhism is just one of the many tools that could promote this, or could work in a socialist society. So yeah, so that's all I have to say for the time being. We've got quite a small group today, so I really want to have some sort of discussion. So are there any questions? Please feel free to ask. I think Ember is reading the chat at the moment.
Yeah, I will, before we open, because I wanted to toss a question for myself before I turn off the recording.
Absolutely.
And let folks freely ask. But as you're talking, especially at the end there, about the capitalism doesn't truly give space for spirituality. It got me thinking about how spirituality is so commodified under capitalism. And
absolutely. And I think as a Buddhist, but I think a lot of Buddhists really struggle with this. I've actually bought malas, prayer beads, for those of you who don't know, and I've got them in the mail. I'm like, oh, this is actually not conducive for, it's just meant to be worn as jewelry. I'm like, that's not the point of these things. It's actually quite offensive, really, that this, something that's meant to be a spiritual aid is not even conducive for that. It's just meant to give you a sort of spiritual aesthetic. Yeah, I think there's a real issue with that. And right. It's I think a lot of, I really encourage religious people to to fight against it, and encourage sorry, I'm rambling a little bit.
No, you're good. Well, no, I think it makes me think about the commodification of yoga. It makes me think, I say that as somebody who has, a certified
Yes.
yoga
Yeah.
teacher training certificate. But also like the context of like businesses that send like their executives on like Buddhist retreats because like you need this to be like a
Yes.
good executive. Like it's amazing how capitalism will find a way to commodify literally anything.
I was initially, ironically, very, very against meditation. When I was dealing with depression, I had loads of people say, try meditation. And, I rolled my eyes and just like, it's one of those things you get told loads. Anyone who's gone through something similar can relate. And I actually did meditation for different reasons. I did meditation because I wanted to improve like my concentration and things like that, rather than to sort of alleviate any mental illness. But yeah, the way meditation is, when you actually read Buddhist philosophy, meditation is very different. It's not just about relaxing yourself. It's a tool for knowledge, and in fact, I've had people say the opposite to me, like, don't if you're suffering from severe depression or anxiety, um, don't meditate because it can make things worse. If you're doing it properly, it can really actually make things worse, because it's not meant to be a tool about relaxing yourself, or I don't know, being better at your job or something like that. Ideally, if meditation's working in the Buddhist sense, you should be rubbish at your job. You should be quitting your job and wanting to go and live in the mountains or something like that. Oh, I don't know. You shouldn't be caring about your job. It's quite interesting actually, because there are studies now saying that people practicing meditation at work are now actually having less interest in their jobs. You're practicing mindfulness, so yeah, it's kind of shooting themselves in the foot there.
Right. Well, and I'll echo. I saw it in the chat. Someone said it's life changing, and yeah, I agree. When done well, it's not always going to make you feel better, but it'll help you be better. So yeah,
Exactly.
I'm gonna go ahead and we'll wrap up our YouTube recording here. So I'm gonna hit stop on that. Thank you if you've joined us on the later recordings.